Hey guys, it's Miss Tarkington. We are going to do First Chapter Friday today, and I want to read the first chapter of Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. I'm going to open it up and read this little short introduction. 13-year-old Brian Robeson maintained his white-knuckle grip on the small plane's controls. Beside him, the pilot lay still and unmoving, the victim of a massive heart attack. Guys, we learned a whole lot right then. Below him lay a dense and seemingly endless stretch of green trees and blue lakes. Brian knows he cannot stay in the air forever, that he must try and land the plane before he runs out of fuel. In his whole life, he's never been so frightened, never felt so alone. But even when Brian crash lands the plane into a lake, his desperate struggle is only just beginning. Isolated in the rugged Canadian wilderness, with nothing to draw upon but a hatchet, the clothes on his back, and his will to survive, Brian must fight to obtain the food, clothing, warmth, and other basic needs that he has taken for granted for so long. In the course of doing so, he learns that pity and self-doubt are luxuries he can no longer afford. And guys, a hatchet is like an axe, but it's the size of a hammer. So where the head of a hammer would be, you would have like this axe, but it's small. You hold it in your hand. All right, let's go ahead and read. I might not read the whole chapter because it's several pages long, but I'll get this started. Brian Robeson stared out the window of a small plane in the endless sea of the great northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring and consuming and loud, it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13 and the only passenger on a plane with a pilot named, what was it, Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had only spoken 5 words to him. Get in the co-pilot's seat. That's the 5 words, which Brian had done, and they had taken off, and that would be the last of the conversation. There'd been the initial excitement, of course. He'd never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot's seat with all the controls right there in front of him, all the instruments in his face as the plane clawed for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind currents as the pilot took off, had been interesting and exciting. But in 5 minutes, they'd leveled off to 6,000 feet and headed northwest, and from then on the pilot had been silent, staring out at the front, and the drone of the engine had been all that was left. The drone and the sea of green trees that lay before the plane's nose and flowed to the horizon, spread with lakes, swamps, and wandering streams and rivers. Now Brian sat looking out the window, with a roar thundering through his ears, and tried to catalog what had led up to his taking this flight. His thinking started. It always started with a single word: divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought, a tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling, lawyers. God, he thought, how he hated lawyers who sat with their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all that he had lived in was coming to an end, coming apart, and the breaking and the shattering of all the solid things, his home, his life, all the solid things. Divorce. A breaking word. An ugly, breaking word. Divorce. Secrets. No, not secrets so much as the secret. What he knew and had not told anybody. What he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce. What he knew. The secret. Divorce. The secret. Brian felt his eyes beginning to burn and knew that there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but they were gone now. He didn't cry now. Instead, his eyes burned, and the tears came, the seeping tears that burned. But he didn't cry. He wiped his eyes with a finger and looked at the pilot out of the corner of his eye to make sure he hadn't noticed the burning and tears. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel and feet on the rudder pedals. He seemed more of a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. On the dashboard in front of him, Brian saw dials and switches, meters, knobs, levers, cranks, lights, handles that were wiggling and flickering, all indicating nothing he understood, and the pilot seemed the same way, part of the plane, not human. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot began to open up a bit and smiled. Ever flew in a co-pilot's seat before? He leaned over and lifted the headset off his right ear and put it on his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. He'd never been in any kind of plane, never seen a cockpit of a plane except in films or on television. It was loud and confusing. First time! It's not as complicated as it looks. Good planes like these almost fly themselves. The pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hands on the controls, your feet on the rudder pedals. I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. No, I better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane slewed suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her easy. Take her light. Take her light. Brian eased off, relaxing his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibrations of the plane came through the wheels and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of the wheel, raised his hands in the air, took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane alone. Simple. Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push the right rudder pedal, a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly, and the plane immediately banked to the right. And when he pressed the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off on the pressure and straightened the wheel, and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn, bring her back to the left a little. Brian turned the wheel left, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled, at least this part. The pilot nodded. All the flying is easy. It just takes learning, like everything else. Like everything else. He took the control backs and reached up and rubbed his left shoulder. Aches and pains. Must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands back on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian, looking out of the window at the ocean of trees and lakes. The burning eyes did not come back, but the memories did. They came flooding in. The words. Always the words. Divorce, the secret, fights, split, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did, knew only what Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come and then the divorce, all so fast, and the court had left him with his mother, except for the summers, with the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Brian hated judges as he hated lawyers. Judges that leaned over the bench and asked Brian if he understood where he was to live and why. Judges who did not know what had really happened. Judges with a caring look that meant nothing, as lawyers said legal phrases that meant nothing. In the summer, Brian would live with his father. In the school year, with his mother. That's what the judge said after looking at papers on his desk and listening to the lawyers talk. Talk. Words. Now the plane lurched slightly to the right, and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder again, and there was a sudden smell of body gas in the plane. So the pilot had passed gas. Brian looked back to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some discomfort. Must have stomach troubles. So this first summer, when he was allowed to have visitation rights with his father, with a divorce only 1 month old, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed and invented a new drill bit for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in the oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started and the forest ended. Brian was riding up from New York with some drilling equipment. It was lashed down in the rear of the plane next to a fabric bag the pilot had called the survival pack, which had an emergency supplies in case they had to make an emergency landing. That had to be especially made in the city. Riding in a bush plane with a pilot named Jim or Jake or something who had turned out to be an all right guy, letting him fly and all. Except for the smell. Now there was a constant odor. And Brian took another look at the pilot and found him rubbing his shoulder and down his arm again, his left arm, letting go more gas and wincing. Probably something he ate, Brian thought. His mother had driven him from the city to meet the plane at Hampton, where it came to pick up the drilling of equipment. The drive in silence, a long drive in silence. 2.5 hours of sitting in the car, staring out of the window, just as he was now staring out the window of a plane. After about an hour, when they were out of the city, Mom turned to him. "Look, can't we talk this over? Can't we talk this out? Can't you tell me what's bothering you?" There was the words again. Divorce. Split. The secret. How could he tell her what he knew? So he remained silent, shook his head, and continued to stare unseeing at the countryside, and his mother had gone back to driving, only to speak one more time when they were close to Hampton. She reached over the back seat and brought up a paper sack. "I got something for you for the trip." Brian took the sack and opened the top. Inside was a hatchet, the kind with a steel handle and a rubber hand grip. The head was in a stout leather case that had a brass riveted belt loop. "It goes on your belt," his mother spoke now, without looking at him. There were some farm trucks on the road now, and she had to weave through them and watch traffic. "The man at the store said you could use it, in the woods with your father." Dad, he thought, not my father, my dad. "Thanks, it's really nice." The words sounded hollow, even to Brian. "Try it on and see how it looks on your belt." So he would normally have said no, that it looked too hokey to have a hatchet on your belt. But those were the normal things he would say. But her voice was thin and had sounded like something thin would break if you touched it. He felt bad for not speaking to her. Knowing what he knew, even with the anger, the hot, white anger, hate he had at her, he still felt bad for not speaking to her. And so to humor her, he loosened his belt, pulled the right side out, put the hatchet on, and rethreaded the belt. "Scooch around so I can see." He moved around in the seat, feeling only slightly ridiculous. She nodded. "Just like a scout, my little scout." And there was the tenderness in her voice that she had when he was small, the tenderness that she had when he was small and sick with a cold, and she put her hand on his forehead, and the burning came into his eyes, and he turned away from her and looked out the window, forgotten the hatchet on his belt, and arrived at the plane with the hatchet still on his belt. Because it was a bush flight from a small airport, there had been no security, and the plane had been waiting with the engine running when he arrived. And he had grabbed his suitcase, pack bag, and run for the plane without stopping to remove the hatchet. So it was still on his belt. At first he had been embarrassed, but the pilot had said nothing about it, and Brian forgot as he took off, and they began flying. More smell now. Bad. Brian turned again to glance at the pilot, who had both hands on his stomach and was grimacing in pain, reaching for his left shoulder again as Brian watched. "Oh, no, kid." The pilot's words were hissed, barely audible. "Bad aches here, bad aches. Thought it was something I ate, but—" He stopped fresh, as a fresh spasm of pain hit him. Even Brian could see how bad it was. The pain drove the pilot back into the seat, back and down. "I never had anything like this." The pilot reached for the switch on his mic cord, his hand coming up from his stomach, and he flipped the switch and said, "This is flight 46. And now the jolt took him like a hammer blow, so forcefully he seemed to crush back into the seat. Brian reached for him. He could not understand at first what it was, could not know. Then he knew. He knew. The pilot's mouth was rigid. He swore and jerked a few series of slams into the seat, holding his shoulder now. He swore. He hissed the chest. "My God, my chest is coming apart." Brian knew now. The pilot was having a heart attack. Brian had been in the shopping mall with his mother when the man in the front of Paisley's store had suffered a heart attack. He'd gone down and screamed about his chest, an old man, much older than the pilot. Brian knew. The pilot was having a heart attack, and even as this knowledge came to Brian, he saw the pilot slam into the seat one more time, one more awful time. He slammed back into the seat, and his right leg jerked, pulling the plane to the right in a sudden twist. His head fell forward, and spit came.